They said the fire had taken it, and they said it so often that the saying became a kind of truth. At Elmore Hall, the story had worn a groove in the household's memory, the way a much-turned page grows soft at the corner. There had been no marriage. Or if there had been a marriage, there was no record of it, for the register had burned in the vestry fire the winter the old rector died, and what the fire did not take the damp had finished. The line was ended. The name was struck through. There was an end to it, and everyone at Elmore had long since stopped asking. Eleanor Vane had learned, over a life spent among books, to distrust any tale that came too smooth. A binding that opened too easily had been broken and mended before. A ledger whose leaves all lay flat had been pressed to hide a swelling. And a story that a whole household told the same way, in the same words with the same little shrug at the end, had usually been agreed upon rather than remembered. She was not a great figure in the world. She was a bookbinder, a slight woman with ink-stained fingers and dark hair pinned beneath a plain linen cap, and she had been brought to Elmore Hall for the humblest of reasons, to set the muniment room to rights. The deeds and the rentals, the court rolls and the letter books, 3 generations of a great family's paper had been left to dust and mice and the slow labor of the wet. Someone was needed to clean and mend and order it. Nobody expected her to find anything. One does not send for a bookbinder to find the truth. One sends for her to save the covers. But Eleanor knew a thing that grander people forgot. Paper is patient. Ink made of oak gall and iron bites into a page and stays, darkening with the years rather than fading, so that a line a careless hand has tried to wash away will often rise again like a bruise beneath the skin. A clerk who does not trust his master will copy a thing twice, and hide the second copy where only another craftsman would think to look. A fire may burn one book. It is a great deal harder to burn every book, in every press, in a house where paper has been hoarded for 200 years. So when they told her, on her first evening, that the marriage had left no trace, when the steward himself said it, smiling, spreading his soft hands as if to show he had nothing to hide, Eleanor said nothing at all. She only looked at the long dim room and its ranks of neglected shelves, and thought, "We shall see what the binding remembers." She did not yet know the name that had been struck out. She did not know the woman who had been called baseborn and turned out of doors, nor the inheritance that had gone quietly sideways into the wrong hands, while everyone agreed to look at the fire. She did not know that the truth of it lay within 20 feet of where she stood that first night, waiting under a false cover for a patient hand. She only knew that she had come to mend books, that she was very good at it, and that a house which prized her so little had no notion of what she could see. That would prove to be their undoing. It would take her the better part of a year, and it would cost her more than her place. But in the end, the quiet woman they called only the bookbinder would stand in the warm light of the great hall, an old restored register open in her 2 hands, and give a duke back a truth his own family had burned. This is how it happened. Elmore Hall stood in a fold of the chalk downs, a great grey house the colour of a rain cloud, with 100 windows that took the morning light and gave it back as gold. Eleanor came to it on a carrier's cart in the last week of a wet spring, her tools in a wooden chest upon her knees, the bone folders, the sewing frame, the pots of paste and the leaves of gold, the knives she had ground herself and let no other hand touch. She had bound books for a bishop and rebacked a Domesday copy for a college, and she had learned that the finer the house, the less it wished to know the name of the woman who kept its treasures whole. She had not always been alone in the work. Her father had been a binder before her, in a narrow shop off a cathedral close, and he had taught her the whole mystery of it from the time she could hold a folder straight. How to pare a skin to the thinness of a breath, how to mix a paste that would hold a century and not draw the worm, how to read the age of a paper by its rattle and its rag. He had left her his tools and his good name in the trade, and very little else, and of them she had made a life that asked no one's leave. She had learned early that a woman who wishes to work must be twice as good and half as loud as any man beside her, and she had contrived to be both. She had learned, too, that to be thanked and then forgotten was not an insult but a mercy, for a hand that is forgotten is a hand left in peace to work. She came to Elmore expecting no more than that, and no less. She was met at a side door by the housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Pell, a spare woman in grey with a ring of keys chiming at her waist, who looked her over once, head to hem, and seemed to find her neither better nor worse than expected. "You'll be the bookbinder," Mrs. Pell said, not Miss Vane. The bookbinder. Eleanor had answered to worse and let it pass. The muniment room lay at the cold north end of the house, down a stone passage that smelled of damp plaster and old smoke. It was a long, high chamber, walled floor to ceiling in oak presses, and it had plainly been left to itself for a generation. Deeds lay curling in open drawers. Letter-books had toppled and splayed. A rental from the time of the second Duke had been gnawed at one corner to a lace of holes, and over it all lay a grey felt of dust so thick that Eleanor's first footprints showed upon the floor like tracks in snow. Her heart absurdly lifted. Here was work a lifetime could not exhaust, and work no one would trouble to watch her do. She walked the length of it slowly, reading the presses as she went. Here were the deeds, folded in their bundles and tied with faded tape, the great seals of dead kings hanging from them in little boxes of tin. Here were the court rolls, membranes of vellum sewn head to foot and rolled tight, the record of a manor's small justice going back past memory. Here the rentals, the surveys, the tithe books, here the letter books in their long dull row, and here apart the estate registers, in which the births and marriages and burials that touched the blood and the leases of Elmore had been set down for 140 years. It was a body of paper as complete as any she had handled, a whole living memory of a family and its land, and someone, she would come to see, had reached into that memory with a careful hand and torn a piece of it out, meaning to leave no scar. But paper is not flesh, paper scars, and a scar to the right eye is a map back to the wound. "His Grace wishes it made orderly," said Mrs. Pell from the doorway, as if reluctant to come further in. The late Duke let it go. "This one means to know what he holds." She hesitated, then added, lower, "Mr. Kroll keeps the papers that signify. The estate business. You're to mind the old and the ruined, the covers, the mending. You're not to trouble the working shelves." Eleanor turned at that. "And which are the working shelves? Mr. Kroll will tell you." The keys chimed, and Mrs. Pell was gone. She met Mr. Silas Kroll within the hour, for he came to inspect her as one inspects a new hound. He was the steward of Elmore, and something more a cousin she would learn of the family, a distant branch grown close to the trunk, a florid, soft-handed man in a bottle-green coat, forever quick to smile. He smiled at her now, standing in the doorway with his thumbs in his waistcoat, and told her how glad the house was to have her, and how little there was truly to do, and how she must on no account tire herself among the ruined books, which were, he said, so much ash and mouse dirt, and not worth a careful hand. There was a fire, he said, comfortably, when she asked which volumes had suffered most. Years back, in the vestry, and the damp since, a deal of the parish record went, and some of ours with it. What's lost is lost, Miss Vane. You mustn't grieve for paper. And he smiled again, and looked at her to see whether she would be satisfied, and Eleanor gave him the small, still look she had given 100 men who thought her simple, and said that she was sure he was right, and that she would begin with the covers. That evening she saw the Duke, though he did not see her. She was carrying a broken folio down the passage to catch the last of the light, and he crossed the far end of the hall, Julian St. Aubin, Duke of Elmore, a tall, grave man in a dark tailcoat, grey-eyed, with a faint scar nicking one brow. He was speaking with his steward, and Kroll was laughing at something, and the Duke was not. He glanced once toward the passage, at the small figure with the ruined book in her arms, and his glance passed over her, as a glance passes over a chair. Then he was gone. She was, to him, a part of the furniture of a house he had inherited and did not yet love. She found she did not mind. It is a great advantage to be furniture. Furniture may look and listen, and no one thinks to guard its tongue. She went to her narrow room under the eaves, and she unpacked her tools, and she laid them out in their order, as she had laid them out in a dozen strange houses, and she slept. And in the morning she began, as she always began, at the beginning, with the oldest, most broken thing in the room, and with the question she asked of every archive she had ever been set to save. Not what does this say? That comes later. The first question is only this: what is missing, and who took the trouble to make it seem it had never been here at all? A bookbinder reads a room before she reads a page. In her first fortnight, Eleanor read the muniment room of Elmore as a physician reads a body, and she found it, everywhere, subtly wrong. She began with the mending as she had been told, and she did it beautifully, because doing it beautifully was both her pride and her cover. She washed the mouse-fouled rental leaf by leaf in a bath of clear water, and let it dry beneath weighted felts. She resewed a book of hours, whose thread had rotted, matching her stitches to the old holes, so that no eye could tell the new work from the old. She lifted a fallen letter book and pressed its wave-buckled pages flat, and while she pressed them she read them, because a bookbinder's eyes fall on words the way a seamstress's fall on a seam, without meaning to, and with judgment. The household grew used to her. Maids passed her in the passage without a glance. Footmen set down her trays and did not wait. She became, as she had meant to become, invisible, and being invisible she began to see. She kept a workbench by the north window, and upon it the order of her craft never varied, for order was how she thought. The bone folders lay in a row from broad to fine. The paste pot sat in its water bath to keep from turning. The sewing frame stood dressed with its cords, and beside it the pricking awl, the paring knives, the paring stone, and the little brass tools for the gold, each in its place, so that her hand might find any of them in the dark, which more than once it did. She could shave a skin so thin the light came through it, and tone a paper patch until a mended tear vanished into the leaf. She could tell, blindfold, calf from sheep, and rag from pulp, by the rattle of a page. And all the while her hands worked, she listened to the house moving above her and around her, and learned its hours and its habits, and which of its doors were oiled and which cried out, and stored it away, as a binder stores the quirks of a difficult book. The house thought her deaf because she was quiet. She was only listening. The registers troubled her first. A great estate keeps its own registers beside the parish ones, books in which a careful steward notes the births, marriages, and burials that touch the family's tenants and its blood, for such things bear on leases and on rights of way, and on who may claim what when an old man dies. Elmore's estate registers ran back, unbroken, for 140 years. Unbroken, that is, but for one gap. Between a volume that closed in the spring of 1799 and a volume that opened in the winter of 1803 there was nothing. 4 years, and no book. When she asked Mrs. Pell, mildly, over the mending, whether a register might have been mislaid, the housekeeper's face closed like a drawer. "That'll be the one the fire took," she said, and would say no more. But Eleanor had handled the volumes on either side of the gap, and they told her a thing that troubled her more. The 1799 book ended with pages to spare, a third of it blank, clean, unused. No steward starts a costly new register, while the old one has 40 empty leaves. The book had not been filled and closed in the natural way. It had been ended before its time, as if someone had wished the record to stop at a certain point, and to begin again in a new hand, safely past it. She said nothing. She noted it, the way she noted the grain of a leather, or the set of a spine, and she kept on. And she began, gently to disobey Mr. Kroll, not openly. She never once went to the shelves he had forbidden her, while any eye could see. But at dusk, when the house was at its dinner and the muniment room was hers, she went along the working presses with a candle, and she looked. She was careful. She wore soft shoes. She learned the rooms above, and where their floors creaked, and what she found, over those quiet weeks, was that the working shelves, the ones she was not to trouble, held the newest and cleanest books, all in Kroll's own square hand, and that the deeper she went into the estate's true memory, the more the volumes had been handled, and pried, and put back not quite as they were found. Someone had been through this archive before her, and not to save it. Once, on the stair, she near enough ran into the Duke. He was coming down with a lamp in his own hand, in his shirt sleeves, which surprised her, for she had thought him the sort of man who never carried his own light. He looked at her, a candle, a small woman, a book pressed to her chest, and this time his glance did not pass over her. "You are the one mending the muniments," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am, your grace. Kroll tells me it is hopeless work, that the best of it is ruined." Eleanor considered the book against her chest, and considered the man, and chose the truth, because the truth told plainly is the most disarming thing a quiet woman owns. "Miss, Kroll is mistaken, your grace. Very little of it is ruined. A great deal of it has been neglected, which looks the same to a hasty eye and is not the same at all. Neglect can be mended. I have not yet found the thing that cannot." And she inclined her head, and went on up the stair, and left him standing with his lamp, looking after her, which she did not see, but felt, the way one feels the sun come out behind one's back. She was careful, after that, not to let his notice change her. A woman in her place who begins to be singled out by the master of a house is a woman who quickly ceases to be invisible, and invisibility was still the best tool she owned. So she thanked him with her eyes, and troubled him with no more words than the work required, and went on being, to all the house, only the bookbinder, quiet, dull, tireless, beneath remark. But something had shifted, and she knew it, and she was too honest with herself to pretend she did not. The grave Duke had looked at her and seen a mind. It was a small thing, and it was everything, for she had gone unseen so long that she had half forgotten she wished to be seen at all, and now, inconveniently, at the worst possible hour, with a secret growing heavier by the week against her ribs, she remembered. She put the feeling away on a high shelf, the way she shelved a book too fine to be handled often, and went back to her work. But she knew where the shelf was. She would come back for it. She learned the name that had been struck out on a market morning in the village of Nether Elmore from an old glover who did not know she was anyone at all. Eleanor had walked down for gallnuts and a fresh pot of paste, and she had fallen into talk with the glover's wife over a tray of seconds, and the talk had turned, as talk in a small place turns, to the great house on the hill. And the old woman, cutting thread, had said a thing that stopped Eleanor's hand above the leather. Aye, they've a new duke up there now, and a hard steward, same as the old. Poor Miss Ashcombe could tell you of the steward, if she'd speak of it, which she won't. Miss Ashcombe? Charlotte Ashcombe. You'll not have met her, she keeps herself very close. Companion now to old Mrs. Tranter, over in Harnham, reads to her, and mends her caps, and is grateful for the roof, they say, which is a hard come down for a woman that was raised to be a lady. The glover's wife lowered her voice, though there was no one by, for she was Edmund Ashcombe's own, Edmund that was cousin to the late Duke, and married, everyone knew he married a Harnham woman for love and against the family's wish. And when he died of the fever, and his wife not a year after him, and the parish register burned that same winter, why, then it was given out that there had been no marriage at all, that the woman had been no wife, that Charlotte was baseborn and had no claim on anything, and the little Ashcombe estate that should have been hers fell in to the family and was let to a tenant. And who do you think holds the lease of it now, and takes the rents, and calls it his own good fortune? She snapped the thread. Mr. Silas Crowell. That's who. Eleanor turned a glove over in her hands, as though considering the stitching, and asked, in the idle way that loosens tongues, whether no one had ever spoken for the woman. The glover's wife sniffed. Spoken for her? The old Duke meant to. That was the talk, that his Grace, the last one, had begun to misdoubt the business, and had said he would look into the marriage and see Miss Charlotte righted. But he was old, and then he was ill, and then he was dead, and this new one come into it all a stranger, with the same steward at his elbow, pouring the same tale into his ear. And Mr. Crowell was very kind to Miss Charlotte when she was put out of her home, found her the place with Mrs. Tranter himself. Oh, he was all kindness. She laughed short and hard. A man is never so kind as when he has robbed you and wishes you to keep quiet and be grateful. So she takes his kindness because she must, and reads to a deaf woman for her bread, and holds her tongue. For what is the word of a base-born nobody against a steward the Duke calls cousin? Eleanor bought her gall nuts, and she walked back up the hill in the wet, and she thought about a book that had been ended before its time, and a 4-year gap where a register should be, and a fire in a vestry the winter a marriage most needed proving. and a steward in a bottle-green coat who took the rents of a woman he had helped to ruin. She thought about a torn page. When you tear a leaf from a bound book, you cannot take the whole leaf. A stub remains, sewn into the spine, a little scar of paper that tells you a page was there and is gone. She had seen such stubs already, in the muniment room, and thought little of them. Now she thought a great deal. She thought too of the shape of the wrong, which was a shape she knew. It was not a crime of passion or of haste. It was a patient crime, a paper crime, done by a man who understood that in England a name lives or dies not by what is true, but by what can be shown, and that a woman with no record is a woman with no mother, no father, no marriage behind her, nothing to stand upon, and nothing to inherit. To unmake a marriage you need not deny it in the street. You need only reach the books before anyone else does, and be quiet, and be trusted, and let the years do the rest. It was, in its cold way, a binder's crime, a thing done to paper by someone who knew what paper could be made to say and not say. And Eleanor thought, climbing the last of the hill in the rain, then it will take a binder to undo it. She did not go to the Duke. What had she? A gap, a rumour, a stub of paper. A great man does not overturn his own steward, his own cousin, the man who has managed his estate and dined at his table, on the word of a bookbinder, who has heard a tale in a glover's shop. She knew how the world was arranged. If she went to him now with half a case, she would be dismissed as a meddler. The shelves would be closed to her for good, and whatever proof remained, if any remained, would quietly finish its long journey into the fire. No, she would do what she had always done. She would say nothing, and be nothing, and work. But now she worked with a purpose sharp as her paring knife. She wanted the marriage, not the rumour of it, the record of it. Somewhere, if her whole craft did not lie to her, some careful hand had set down that Edmund Ashcombe married a Harnham woman in a certain church in a certain year, and that from that marriage came a lawful heir. The parish copy was ash. Kroll had seen to that. She was all but sure. But a marriage that touched the blood of Elmore would have been noted in the estate register too, in the very book that had been ended before its time and then, 4 years of it, made to vanish into a fire. One copy Kroll could burn. She had wagered her place, now, on the chance that a nervous clerk, long ago, had made 2. She found the first thread of it by touch, in the dark, on an evening when the family was at cards. She had been working along the deep presses for a week, with a particular question in her hands. If a register had been removed, bodily taken, not burned, then the shelf that held it kept the shape of its absence. Books lean. A run of volumes stands close as teeth, each holding its neighbour upright. Take one away, and the others tilt into the gap and, over years, set in that lean like a crooked smile. She went along the estate registers with her candle low, reading not the spines but the leaning, and near the join of 2 presses she found it, a place where the books tilted toward a hollow 4 fingers wide, and where the dust on the shelf boards, everywhere else unbroken, showed a clean rectangle. A book had stood there within living memory. A book had been drawn out and never put back. It was the missing years. She was as sure of it as of her own name. But that told her only that the book was gone, which she had guessed. It did not give her the marriage. For that she went to the letter books. An estate's letter books are its copybooks of correspondence, dull, dutiful volumes in which a steward's clerk transcribes the letters sent out in the master's name, so that the house may always know what it has promised. They are the least regarded books in any muniment room, and so, Eleanor had found across a lifetime, they are where the truth most often survives, precisely because no one thinks them worth the trouble of a lie. Elmore's ran in a long row, and she went through them by the week, reading every close-written page, and it was in the letter-book for the years, about the gap that her fingers, turning a leaf, stopped. The book was wrong in the hand. She knew it before she knew why. She held the candle close. The volume was bound in the same calf as its fellows, tooled in the same pattern, but the leather was a shade fresher, the joints a shade tighter, the sewing, when she bent the spine gently to the light, done with a thread that did not match the others in the row. This letter-book had been taken apart and bound again. Rebound, and not long ago, by a workman good enough to match the old, but not good enough to fool a binder. And a letter-book, of all the useless books in the world, is the last a busy steward would trouble and pay to rebind, unless the binding itself were the point. Unless something had been taken out of it, or something hidden in it, and the whole sewn up new to cover the wound. She sat down on the cold floor with the rebound letter-book in her lap and her candle at her side, and she did what her craft forbade and her conscience that night required. She argued with herself a long moment. There on the cold floor, for what she meant to do went against every article of her trade. A binder does not violate a binding, even a false one. She mends, she conserves, she leaves the past intact for those who come after. To lift a paste-down is to break a seal. But she had learned, over the reading of the registers and the tale in the glover's shop, that there are two kinds of faithfulness, and that they had come here to war with one another. She could be faithful to the binding, leave the wound sewn up, and go home at the end of her year having saved a great many covers and betrayed a living woman. Or she could be faithful to the truth the binding hid, and break the false seal to set it free. It was not, when she put it so, a hard choice. It only felt like one, because she had spent her life being the kind of hand that leaves things exactly as it finds them. Very gently, with the flat of her bone folder, she lifted the marbled paper of the paste-down, the leaf a binder glues to the inside of a cover to hide his work, at one corner, where old paste had already begun to fail. It came up unwilling, but whole, and beneath it, laid flat against the board where a rough hand had hidden it, and a smooth new binding had sealed it, was a single folded leaf of paper, browned at the edges, that did not belong to the letter-book at all. She did not open it there. Her hands, she found, were not quite steady, and a shaking hand tears old paper. She pressed the paste-down back down with her thumb, so that no eye would see it had been lifted, and she carried the whole letter-book up to her room under the eaves, and she barred her door, and she trimmed her candle, and only then, on a clean cloth, with the care she would have given a saint's relic, did she draw the hidden leaf out and unfold it. It was a page torn from a register. The stub edge matched, and across it, in a clerk's neat, frightened, long-ago hand, ran the entry of a marriage, that on the 11th day of June, in a year she read 3 times to be sure of, Edmund Charles Ashcolme, bachelor, of this parish, was married to Mary Tranter, spinster, of Harnham, and there, below, in the same careful hand, a second entry, and a note in the margin that turned the whole thing from a wrong righted to a wrong she did not yet understand. The margin note was in a different ink. The entry of the marriage was in the clerk's neat hand, gall black and certain, but cramped into the margin beside it, in a smaller, hastier, more private hand, someone had written a line for himself, and not for any master. Copied faithfully from the parish book this day, the register being called for at the hall, and I misdoubting it. God forgive the doubt if I wrong an honest house. J. M. Eleanor read it, and the cold of the floor went up through her, and it was not the cold that made her shiver. She understood, all at once, what she held. Long ago a clerk, J. M., some Josiah or John or James, dead these many years, most likely, and never to know what he had done, had been ordered to fetch the parish register up to the hall. And the clerk had misdoubted it. He had feared what would become of a book once it went up that hill and did not come down. And so, before he gave it over, he had copied the marriage line faithfully into the estate register in his own keeping, and then, when even that book was called for, he had done a braver and a stranger thing. He had torn his own copy out and hidden it in the one place a steward would never think a humble clerk would dare to touch, sewn flat into the boards of a letter book, under the paste-down where it had waited through a fire, a burial, a lie, and the slow ruin of an innocent woman, for someone with a bone folder and a doubting mind to lift the corner and let it breathe. This was the twist that turned the whole matter over in her hands like a coin. She had come believing she must find a record that had survived a fire by luck. She saw now that nothing had survived by luck. The fire had not been an accident that a lucky copy escaped. The fire had been set. She was as certain of it as of the grain beneath her thumb, set to destroy the parish book precisely because the marriage was in it, and the estate register drawn out and burned or buried for the same cause. Someone had gone to great and patient trouble to unmake a marriage, and one frightened, honest clerk, long dead, had gone to greater trouble still to keep it made. The proof in her hands was not a thing that had been forgotten. It was a thing that had been fought over, in the dark, by people who would never meet, and the honest one had won, and did not live to know it. She thought of him, the clerk, J. M., whoever he had been. A small man surely in a cold office, with a master he had come to fear, and a conscience he could not quite put down. He had had everything to lose and nothing to gain. No one had asked him to be brave. He might have copied the line and said nothing, and kept his place, and let the marriage go the way his master wished it gone, and no ledger in the world would have accused him. Instead, he had copied it, and hidden his copy, and written in the margin, for no eyes but God's and, as it fell out, hers, that he misdoubted the honest house he served, and begged forgiveness if he wronged it. He had not wronged it. He had been the only honest thing in it. And he had died, Eleanor was sure, never knowing whether his hidden leaf would be found, or would rot forgotten under a false cover through the slow centuries. He had done the right thing into the dark, with no promise of a harvest, which is the hardest kind of right thing there is. She owed him, this stranger a generation dead, the finishing of his work. It was, she found, a debt she was glad to owe. She sat a long while. Then her craft, which was also her conscience, told her what to do, and it was not what her fear wished. Her fear wished to run to the Duke that very night, and thrust the leaf into his hands. But a single leaf of old paper, however true, is a frail thing in a hard court. It could be called a forgery. It could be taken and lost. It could be burned in an afternoon, as its fellow had been burned, and then she would have nothing but a wild tale and no place in the house. No. She would do the thing a bookbinder does, the thing that had saved the marriage once already. She would make it survive by making it more than one thing. She would copy the leaf faithfully in her own hand, with the date and the note and the very look of it, and she would seal her copy, where a second doubting mind might one day find it, and she would restore the true leaf, not hide it again, but restore it, bound back into an estate register, in its right place, sewn and mended so that it could stand as evidence in the light of day, and no man could say it was a loose scrap smuggled in. She would give the truth a spine, and she would need, for that, one more thing: the ended register. The book with the 4 blank years that still stood on its shelf where the marriage had been struck out. For a torn stub in that book, matched to the torn edge of her hidden leaf, would prove past any lawyer's doubt that this page had been torn from that book, that the marriage had been in the estate register of Elmore, in its lawful place, and had been ripped out by a living hand. The leaf alone was a claim. The leaf married back to its stub was a conviction. She rose, stiff and cold and more awake than she had been in years, and she hid the true leaf between 2 boards in her own tool chest, beneath the leaves of gold, where no one would rummage. And in the days that came, she went looking, quietly, terribly quietly, for the mutilated book. And, without knowing it, she began at last to be seen by the one man in the house whose seeing could save or ruin her. It began with his mother's prayer book. The Duke of Elmore came to the muniment room himself one grey afternoon, a rare thing, carrying a small, sad, water-stained volume, as a man carries something he is half ashamed to care about. It was a lady's prayer book, bound in worn morocco, the boards sprung, the spine perished, the leaves cockled and foxed, where a leaking roof had wept on it in some storeroom for a decade. "This was my mother's," he said without preamble, setting it before her. "It was spoiled through carelessness. I am told you mend things. I do not expect a miracle. I only—" He stopped, and Eleanor, a slight woman with ink-stained fingers and dark hair pinned beneath a plain linen cap, understood that the grave Duke had come to her not as a master to a workman, but as a man who had lost his mother, and then, through neglect, lost the last warm thing her hands had held, and could not quite say so. "I do not perform miracles either, Your Grace," she said gently, turning the little book in the light, reading its hurts. "But this is not past mending. The paper has been wetted, not destroyed. The binding is perished, but I can save the boards, and the leaves will flatten, and here, do you see at the front, she has written her name, and the ink has spread, but not gone. I can lift and set it so it will not spread further. When I am done, it will not be as it was, but it will be hers again, and it will last another 100 years. That I can promise you." He looked at her then as he had not looked at her before, as at a person, and moreover a person who could do a thing he could not, and value a thing he valued. "You speak of it," he said slowly, "as if you knew what it was worth." "I know what everything on these shelves is worth, Your Grace," she answered. "It is my trade to know, Most of it is worth more than the house believes." And she did not look at the deep presses when she said it, though it cost her something not to. She mended the prayer book over a week, and she did it as the finest work of her life. And when she gave it back, the leaves flat and clean, the name saved, the boards rebacked in Morocco so near the old that only the fresh smell of it betrayed the repair, the Duke held it a long moment without a word, and when he looked up his grey eyes were not quite steady, and he said, "Thank you," in the low voice of a man thanking someone for far more than a book. After that he came often to the muniment room. He told himself and her that he came to see how the great work went forward. In truth he came because in that long dim room, among the smell of paste and leather and old paper, was the one place at Elmore where a woman spoke to him plainly and asked nothing of him, and where a quiet competence went about its business and made the ruined whole. He began to bring her his questions about the family's history, and she began to answer them from the books, and a slow, unspoken, entirely improper regard grew up between the grave Duke and the bookbinder, over the mending of old pages, and neither of them named it. And Silas Kroll watched it grow with the fixed smile of a man watching a crack widen in a wall he had built. One evening near the turn of summer, he found her still at her bench long after the household had gone up, a single candle burning, her hands stilled over an open estate book she was not, in truth, cataloguing. He did not ask what she read. He drew up the other stool, a duke, upon a workman's stool, in his own muniment room, and sat. And for a while neither spoke, and the quiet was not uneasy. "My father meant to set this room to rights," he said at last. "He never did. He grew afraid of it, I think, toward the end, as though there were something in here he did not wish to find, and did not wish to leave, and could not choose between. He turned a paring knife over in his fingers, carefully respecting its edge. I inherited his fear along with his shelves. You are the first person I have known who is not afraid of this room." Eleanor said that a room was only paper, and paper only told what a hand had set down, and there was nothing in paper to fear but the truth, which was a thing worth more than fear. He looked at her a long moment in the candlelight. "You speak of the truth as though it were a friend of yours." "It is the only master I have never had cause to leave," she answered. And he laughed, a short, surprised, unpracticed laugh, the laugh of a grave man who has forgotten he owns one, and the sound of it hung in the dim room between them like something warm, and both of them, hearing it, looked quickly back to the book, and did not name what had passed, because it could not be named, and both of them knew it. For Kroll was not a fool. He had marked, before Eleanor herself had marked it, that the Duke's glance now sought the small figure in the linen cap, and he had marked too that the bookbinder went too often and lingered too long among the presses he had told her to leave alone. He began to come to the muniment room at odd hours, unheralded, and to find her, always at some innocent labor, always with an innocent book, and to smile, and to remark how devoted she was, how very thorough, and to hope, with great warmth, that she did not overtire herself among matters that need not concern her. And once, lifting a volume she had left upon the table, turning it in his soft hands, he said, still smiling, "You have a great curiosity, Miss Vane, for a house that is not your own." And Eleanor, taking the book gently back from him, said that curiosity was the whole of her trade, and that a binder who was not curious would sew the pages in upside down, and she smiled too. But when he had gone, she found that her hands were cold, and she moved the true leaf that night from her tool chest to a new place, sewn into the lining of her own stays, against her ribs where no search of her room could find it. She had begun to understand that she was no longer merely unseen. She was watched, and a watched woman with a secret must move faster than the eyes upon her. She found the mutilated register on the same day that Silas Kroll found her out. The ended book, the one with the 4 blank years, stood, she had reasoned, not among the estate registers where its absence had first drawn her eye, for that gap was the removed volume, the one drawn bodily out. The book she needed was subtler. The register that had been ended before its time closed off a third empty, so that the record could be made to leap the dangerous years. She had passed it a dozen times. It was shelved among the rentals, out of its place, which was itself a kind of hiding. A book put where it does not belong is a book someone did not wish found by anyone who knew the order of things. She drew it out at last, on a bright cold afternoon, carried it to the window, and turned to the final written pages before the long blank. And there, close to the end, between the entry of a burial and the entry of a lease, she found the scar she had crossed the whole year to find. A stub. A page torn out close to the sewing, its edge a ragged little cliff of paper. She had the true leaf against her ribs. She did not need to hold them together to know. But she laid the book open on the sill, and she breathed, and she thought, I have you. After 100 small deceptions, one honest thing, torn and mended, would undo the lot. So this is where you spend your evenings, said Silas Kroll from the doorway. He had come without a sound, in soft house shoes, a florid, soft-handed man in a bottle-green coat, forever quick to smile, and he was smiling now, but the smile had gone all the way to nothing behind the eyes. He crossed the room and looked down at the open register, at the very pages, and Eleanor watched his face and saw him understand precisely what she had been reading, and saw him decide, in the space of a breath, what he would do. She had a heartbeat to choose her own course, and she chose, as she always chose. Stillness, I am cataloguing the registers, Mr. Kroll, she said. This one had been mis-shelved. Among the rentals. I was returning it to its order. Were you? He turned a leaf and another to the torn stub and laid one soft finger against it, almost tenderly. A sad thing, how the mice get in. And the damp. So much lost. He looked up, and now he did not trouble to smile. You are a clever woman, Miss Vane. Cleverer than a bookbinder has any cause to be. I have watched you go where you were bid not to go, and pry where you were bid not to pry, and make sheep's eyes at his grace over his mother's psalter. And I have asked myself what a woman of your sort wants in a house like this. And do you know, I begin to think you want what everyone wants. Money, a settlement, a quiet arrangement to look the other way. He spread his hands, the old easy gesture. I am not an unreasonable man. Tell me what you have found, and what it would take to make you forget you found it, and we need never trouble his grace with any of it. And there it was, the offer that was also a confession, laid on the table between them like a card turned face up. He would not have offered to buy her silence if there had been nothing to be silent about. Eleanor felt the true leaf against her ribs, and she felt the whole shape of the thing settle into place, the fire, the gap, the rebound book, the ruined woman in Harnham mending caps for her bread, and she felt something she very rarely felt, which was anger, cold and clean and steadying. But she had not lived a quiet life by showing her hand to a smiling man. So she looked down and let her shoulders fall and said in a small voice that she was only a poor woman who wished to keep her place, and that she had found nothing, nothing at all, but old torn books and mouse dirt, just as he had always said. And she saw him not believe her, and she saw him decide, all the same, that a frightened woman who protested she had found nothing was a woman who could be managed, or removed. Good, said Kroll softly. Then we understand one another. And he took the register, the mutilated register, the very book with the stub, from the sill, tucked it under his arm as though it were his own, and walked out with it. I'll see this properly stored, he said over his shoulder. You've enough to do. And he was gone, and with him the matched stub she had crossed a year to find, and Eleanor stood at the window with her true leaf against her ribs and her whole case walking away under a steward's arm, and understood that the slow, safe, patient way was closed to her now. She would have to be quick, and she would have to be bold, and she would have to gamble everything she had built on a single throw, tonight, before the book with the stub went into the same fire that had taken its fellow. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the true leaf against her ribs and made herself think, coldly, the way she thought over a ruined book. Not what has been lost, but what remains, and what may yet be made of it. Kroll had the register with the stub. That was grievous, but it was not the end, for the leaf and the stub were only one of the proofs, and she had been taught by a dead clerk's example to trust nothing to a single copy. She had the leaf itself. She had the letter book that had hidden it, which was proof of the hiding. She could make more, and she understood, sitting there in the dark, that Kroll had made one error in all his patient care. By taking the register he had shown her that he feared it, and a man does not trouble to steal and burn a book that says nothing. His theft was itself a confession, one she could not yet spend, but a confession all the same. She would answer patience with patience, but faster she would answer paper with paper, but more of it, and she would bring it, at the last, not to a corner where it could be tidied quietly away, but into the open light, before witnesses, where a stolen book and a frightened woman's silence would no longer be enough. She wrote to Charlotte Ashcombe by the first light, a plain, honest letter with no flourish in it, and she paid a stable hand out of her own small savings to carry it to Harnham and wait for an answer. And then she did the thing her whole craft had been preparing her to do. Though she had not known it, she restored the truth so that it could not be destroyed by destroying any one book. She had the true leaf, the torn marriage line, with the clerk's note in the margin. That Kroll could not now reach. It lay against her ribs. But the stub that matched it was walking away inside the mutilated register, toward the fire. So Eleanor did what a binder does when the original is in peril. She made the evidence redundant. Through that day and the short night after, by candle, in her room under the eaves, she worked as she had never worked. First, she copied the marriage line entire, in a fair clear hand, onto good paper. Not to pass her copy for the original, but so that the words themselves might survive even if the leaf were seized, the names, the date, the parish, the clerk's initials, the margin note, every stroke set down, and beneath it her own name, and the date of her copying, and a plain account of where she had found the leaf and how. A bookbinder's deposition. Then she took the true leaf itself and did the braver thing. She did not hide it again. She mounted it, hinged it on a guard of fine linen, the way a museum hand mounts a precious single sheet, so that it could be bound into a book and turned and read and yet never be loose, never be a scrap that a clever tongue could call a plant. And she sewed it, with the mounted guard, into the front of the very letter book in which the clerk had first hidden it, rebinding that book a second time honestly now, so that the leaf stood in it plain and fixed and part of the whole, with her linen guard and her fair copy and her signed account all sewn in together behind it. She gave the truth a spine, and a witness, and a home. She worked the rebinding as slowly and as truly as if a bishop had commissioned it, for she knew that one day a hard man in a black coat would turn these very leaves, looking for the flaw that would let him call the whole thing false, and she meant him to find none. She sewed the mounted leaf on its linen guard onto a new support, so that it hinged clean and lay flat and could not be worked loose without cutting threads that plainly had not been cut. She tipped in her fair copy and her signed account on their own guards in their order, so that the book read from the first opening like a plain and honest testimony. Here is the leaf, here is where I found it, here in my own hand and over my own name is how. She toned no paper to deceive and hid no join. Where she had mended, she let the mend be seen. For an honest repair that shows itself is worth more before a magistrate than an invisible one that a clever tongue might call a forgery. She pared the new leather thin and pasted it true, and pressed the book between her boards through the last of the night, and when she lifted it out at dawn it was a sound, whole, honest thing that would open flat upon a table and say the same true thing to any hand that turned it. For 100 years, whatever became of the woman who had made it. And she understood, as she stitched, that a bound book with a mounted original and a signed account was a far harder thing to burn or to gainsay than a torn scrap or a single stubbed register. Kroll could take one book. He could not take the fact, now fixed in linen and thread, that these things had been found together by a named hand on a named day. She was making the truth heavy. Heavy things are hard to make vanish. At dawn, the stable hand came back from Harnham, wet through and proud of himself, with an answer. Charlotte Ashcombe would come. More, Charlotte Ashcombe wrote, in a hand as plain and steady as Eleanor's own, that she had kept, all these years, a thing she had never been able to use, her mother's own account of the wedding, written in a letter to a friend, the friend long dead, and a letter come back to Charlotte's keeping. A letter that named the church, the day, the clerk, the witness who signed. It proved nothing alone. A private letter is not a register. But laid beside a torn leaf from the estate book, and a matched stub, and an honest copy, it was another voice in the same story. And every honest voice made the lie harder to sustain. I have carried it 11 years, Charlotte wrote, and been called a liar and worse for a truth I could not show. If you have found the register, Miss Vane, then God has been slower than I prayed, but not, after all, asleep. Tell me the hour, and I will come. Though I have not the coach fare and must walk the half of it, I am not too proud to walk toward my own name. Eleanor read that, and folded it, and put it with the rest. And then she did the last and hardest thing, which was to go to the Duke, not with a whisper in the muniment room, but openly, and to ask him, before witnesses, for a hearing. For she had learned that a wrong undone in a corner can be tidied away again in a corner. To hold, a truth must be shown in the light, before enough eyes that it cannot afterward be unseen. She would ask His Grace of Elmore to assemble his family, his solicitor, his steward, and to let the bookbinder say her piece and show her book. It was an outrageous thing for a woman of her place to ask. She asked it anyway. And the grave Duke, who had come to trust the quiet hands that had given him back his mother's prayer book, looked at her a long moment, and did not laugh and said, "You would not ask this of me lightly." Name the day. They gathered in the great hall 3 days later, in the late gold of a clearing afternoon, and it was the room of the whole matter come to its head, a long sunlit hall lined with tall shelves of leather ledgers, warm light pouring through the high windows, the family of Elmore seated in their carved chairs, and one slight woman standing before them with a book in her hands. The Duke of Elmore sat at the center, a tall, grave man in a dark tailcoat, grey-eyed, with a faint scar nicking one brow. At his right hand sat his aunt, Lady Prudence St. Aubyn, an upright woman in lavender silk with a lorgnette on a chain, who had come prepared to be scandalized that a bookbinder should be given the floor at all. At a side table sat Mr. Josiah Hale, the family's solicitor, a dry, bespectacled man clutching a black leather case, who had been told only that a question touching the estate would be raised, and who disliked surprises. And a little apart, standing not sitting, with the easy confidence of a man who has managed this family for 20 years, was Silas Crowell, a florid, soft-handed man in a bottle-green coat, forever quick to smile, and he was smiling now, though his eyes went at once and stayed upon the book in Eleanor's hands, and did not leave it. He had not been able to prevent this hearing without seeming to fear it. So he had come to master it, as he mastered everything, with a warm word and a ready doubt. Eleanor came into that grand room as she had come into every grand room of her life, quietly, by the side, with a book held to her breast, but this time she did not go to the edge and wait to be forgotten. She walked to the open space before the seated family and stood in the fall of gold light from the high windows, a slight woman with ink-stained fingers and dark hair pinned beneath a plain linen cap, and she let them look at her, and she was not afraid of the looking. She had spent a year being furniture in this house, so that this hour might come, and now that it had come she found her hands were steady, because her hands, at least, had never once lied, and did not mean to begin. Lady Prudence lifted her lorgnette, and studied her as one studies an insect that has strayed onto the cloth. Mr. Hale frowned over his spectacles and drew out a fresh sheet, from long habit, to take down whatever folly was about to be spoken. And Silas Crowell smiled, and set his back against a book-press, and folded his soft hands and prepared with the ease of 20 untroubled years to let this small woman say her small piece, and then to bury it under 3 warm sentences. None of them, watching her come, knew that they were the ones on trial. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, and her voice in that grand room was low but did not shake, "you engaged me to set your muniments to rights. In doing so I found a wrong, and I have come to lay it before you, because it is not mine to mend alone. I will show you a thing, and I will tell you plainly how I came by it. And you and Mr. Hale shall judge whether I am a liar or a fool, or neither." "This is most irregular," said Lady Prudence, but the Duke lifted one hand, and she subsided, and Eleanor went on. She told it plainly, as she had promised, the gap in the registers. The book ended before its time, the run of leaning volumes, and the clean rectangle in the dust where a book had stood and been taken. She told of the letter book bound in fresher calf with a stranger's thread, and how a letter book is the last book a busy man would trouble to rebind unless the binding were the point. And then she opened the book she carried, the letter book she had honestly rebound with her own hands, and turned it to where, mounted on its linen guard, plain and fixed, and catching the gold light, lay the torn leaf with the marriage line upon it. She read it aloud into the hush, Edmund Charles Ashcombe, bachelor, married to Mary Tranter, spinster, on the 11th of June, and beneath, the lawful heir of that marriage, and in the margin, in a dead clerk's frightened hand, copied faithfully from the parish book this day, the register being called for at the hall, and I, misdoubting it. "That is a forgery," said Silas Kroll warmly, easily into the silence. "A clever one. Miss Vane is a skilled binder, none more so, and skilled binders, your grace, can make old paper say whatever a scheming mind requires. She has heard a sad village tale and made herself a document to match it. Where is the register this leaf is torn from? A loose page proves nothing. Any hand may write a name." And he spread his soft hands, and looked to the Duke, and it was well done, it was very well done, for it was true that a loose leaf proves nothing, and he knew none better that the register it was torn from was under his own lock, and meant for the fire. A murmur went round the seated family at that, and Eleanor felt the room tilt toward the steward, as rooms had tilted toward smiling, confident men all her life, while they tilted away from quiet women with inconvenient papers. Lady Prudence said audibly that it was just as she had foreseen, and that the creature had imposed upon them all. Mr. Hale's pen had stopped. Even the Duke's grave face had gone guarded, for Kroll had said the one thing that could not be simply waved away, that a single leaf proves nothing, that skilled hands make old paper lie, and it was, so far as it went, entirely true. It was the moment on which everything turned, the moment Kroll had counted on, when doubt is easier than belief, and a comfortable room longs to be told that the comfortable thing is also the true one. Eleanor let the murmur run its course. She had learned that a truth spoken over noise is only more noise, and that the quiet hand wins by waiting for the quiet. "You are right, Missy Kroll," said Eleanor, and the mildness of it turned every head. "A loose page proves nothing. A page torn from a book leaves a stub, a little scar sewn in the spine, and the leaf and its stub matched edge to edge, prove past any doubt that this page was torn from that book. You are quite right to ask for the register." She let the silence stretch one breath. "You took it from me yourself, 3 days since. The estate register with the 4 blank years that you carried out of the muniment room under your arm to store it properly. I should be glad, Miss Hale, if the register were sent for now, that the torn edge might be laid against this leaf before your eyes. Unless," and she looked at last full at Kroll, "unless the book has met with some accident since it came into Mr. Kroll's keeping." For a moment no one moved, and in that moment the whole matter turned, silently, on its hinge, for every eye had gone to Silas Kroll, and Silas Kroll's smile had at last come apart. "The register is," he began, and stopped, because there was no safe end to the sentence. If he produced the book, the stub would damn him. If he said the book was lost or burned in the 3 days since he had openly carried it away before a witness, he would damn himself as surely, for who but he could have destroyed it, and why but this? The Duke was looking at him now, and it was not the look of a master at a trusted steward. It was the still, cold, attending look of a man to whom a great many small, strange things A curtailed register, a rebound letter book, a woman warned off the shelves, a kinswoman left to mend caps in Harnham, while her estate paid its rents into a bottle-green pocket, were all, at once, arranging themselves into a single ugly shape. "Send for the register, Kroll," said the Duke of Elmore, very quietly. "Now yourself, and bring it here into this room. There is a kind of ruin that arrives not with a blow, but with a silence, and it arrived for Silas Kroll in the gold light of that hall." He did not send for the register. He could not, for he had already, in his haste, done the thing Eleanor had gambled he would not quite dare to do so soon. He had that very morning had the book carried to the estate office to be burned with the autumn rubbish, and the fire was not yet lit, and a footman dispatched at the Duke's word found it at the top of the heap, singed along one edge by an ember but whole, its pages entire. When it was brought in and laid upon the table, and Mr. Hale with his dry, careful hands opened it to the stub, and Eleanor laid her mounted leaf beside it, the torn edges ran together tooth for tooth, fibre for fibre. One paper that had been made one leaf and cruelly parted, and no person in that room, however willing, could pretend it was two. "It matches," said Mr. Josiah Hale, and his dry voice had lost its dryness. He looked up over his spectacles, first at the leaf, then at the singed edge of the register, then, for a long moment, at Silas Kroll. "Your Grace, this leaf was torn from this book." The marriage of Edmund Ashcombe stood recorded in the estate register of Elmore, in its lawful place, and was torn out by a living hand. And this book was, by the evidence of my own eyes and this scorching, within the hour of being burned. He drew a slow breath. "I have been solicitor to this family for 30 years. I signed at Mr. Kroll's instance the deed that let the Ashcombe estate to Mr. Kroll himself, on the sworn understanding that the late Edmund Ashcombe left no lawful heir. I did so in good faith. I see now that my good faith was abused." "There was a letter," said a new voice from the doorway, clear, steady, and roughened at its edge by long grief, and every head turned. Charlotte Ashcombe stood there, a composed woman in mended mourning black, with steady hazel eyes. She had walked the half of the way from Harnham as she had said she would, and her hem was grey with the road, and she held in her hand a worn folded letter. My mother's own account of her wedding, written to her friend in the week after, and come back to me when the friend died. It names the church, and the day, and the witness, and the clerk. One J. Meredith, who is dead these 9 years, and whose initials, I am told, are in that margin. I have carried it 11 years, and been called baseborn to my face for a truth I could not show. I could not show it. She and Charlotte Ashcombe looked at Eleanor, and her steady voice went, for the first time, unsteady. She is a stranger to me, and she has given me back my mother and my father and my own honest name, and I do not know how in this life I am to thank her. For a moment the great hall was utterly still, and then it was not. For a room in which a wrong has just been named aloud and proven cannot stay still. It stirs, it murmurs, it rearranges itself around the new truth like iron filings around a magnet newly turned. Lady Prudence had lowered her lorgnette and was staring at the singed register with a face that had forgotten to be scandalized. Mr. Hale was writing quickly now, his dry mouth pressed thin. And the Duke of Elmore had risen from his chair and crossed the space that no one else had dared to cross, and stood before Charlotte Ashcombe, and bowed to her. Bowed. A duke to a woman in mended mourning black, who had walked half the way from Harnham to be called by her right name, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole room to hear and to keep, "Cousin, you are welcome in this house, which has wronged you, and which will spend a long while making it right." And Charlotte Ashcombe, who had held her tongue and her grief for 11 hard years, put her worn letter to her mouth and wept at last, not for the estate, nor even for the name, but because someone with the power to say it had finally said, aloud and before witnesses, that she had been telling the truth. What followed, the settling of it, took the law many months, as the law takes everything. But the matter itself was decided in that hole, in that hour, and never after in doubt. Silas Kroll did not bluster long. A man whose whole art is the warm word and the ready doubt has nothing left when the doubt is answered, and the warmth curdles in every face turned toward him. He tried once the old spread of the soft hands, a misunderstanding, a zeal for the family's interest, a book set by for burning through a clerk's blunder and no design of his, but the singed register lay upon the table, and the matched leaf beside it, and the dead clerk's honest note accused him from the margin in the very hand he had schemed against, and Josiah Hale was already drawing paper toward him, with a face like a closing door. The Duke of Elmore rose from his carved chair, and the room rose with the fact of him, and he looked at the man who had managed his house, and dined at his table, and lied to him under his own roof for 20 years, and he said only, "You will give Mr. Hale the keys, and the accounts, and the lease of the Ashcombe estate, and you will be out of this house tonight. What the law will make of arson, and of a marriage struck from a register, and of an inheritance stolen from an honest woman, is no longer mine to soften. You have leaned on my name for the last time." And he turned his back, which for a man of his rank was the whole of a sentence, and Silas Kroll was led away to gather what was his, and was gone from Elmore before the light failed, and the estate he had stolen with a torn page was restored, in law and in fact, to Charlotte Ashcombe, whom no one at Elmore ever again called anything but by her right name. But this is not, in the end, a story about the man who was undone. It is a story about the woman who was seen. When the hall had emptied, when Lady Prudence had swept out full of a new opinion she would give as her own within the week, and Mr. Hale had gone away with his case bulging, and Charlotte Ashcombe had been taken by Mrs. Pell to a warm room and a warmer welcome, the Duke of Elmore stayed, and Eleanor stayed, among the long gold shelves and the honest book still open on the table between them. "You could have come to me the first week," he said at last, "with the gap in the registers and the tale from the village. I would have," he stopped, and was honest, because he had learned honesty from watching her. "No, I would not have believed you. I would have believed Kroll, and thought you a meddling woman, and had the shelves closed. You knew that. That is why you did not come. You let me think you furniture until you could put the truth in my hands too heavy to drop." "I gave it a spine, your grace," said Eleanor. "It is what I do. A truth that is loose can be lost. A truth that is bound must be read." She closed the letter book gently, her ink-stained fingers flat upon the cover she had made. "I am only the bookbinder. But a binding remembers what a fire forgets. It was never I that saved this marriage. It was a frightened clerk, dead 30 years, who copied a line twice, because he misdoubted an honest house, and could not live with the doubt. I only lifted the corner he hid it under. Any patient hand would have found it." "No," said the Duke of Elmore, "not any hand. and he looked at her, a slight woman with ink-stained fingers and dark hair pinned beneath a plain linen cap, standing in the last gold light of his family's hall, and he looked at her as no one in that house had looked at her since she came. Not as a workman, not as furniture, but as the one person under his roof who had seen clearly when all the rest of them, himself the first, had agreed to look at the fire. Miss Vane, when these muniments are ordered, and I find I should like them to be ordered slowly, and thoroughly over a great many years, I should be glad if the person who set them right did not go away. Elmore has been, I think, a house that did not know the worth of what it held. I should like it to become a house that does. I should like, and the grave Duke, who was not a man of easy words, found that the words were there after all. I should like to learn to see the way you see. It would take a lifetime. I have one to spend. Eleanor Vane, who had bound books for a bishop, and been called only the Bookbinder in 100 grand houses and never once minded, found that she minded now, minded and was glad, and had nothing quiet left to say. The low sun came through the high windows and lay warm along the shelves of ledgers, and gilded the open book between them, and gilded the two who stood over it, and somewhere in the honest weight of that binding a dead clerk's doubt was answered at last, and a struck name stood restored in the light, and a woman who had spent her life unseen was, in the end, and for the rest of it, seen. That is the whole of it, and it is true, every line, for it was written down faithfully by a patient hand, and a binding remembers.